presentation that helps me out a lot, because then I can skip all over a lot of those things and dive straight into a much drier sort of academic discussion, I suppose. So that was really good. And I think the live list would be fantastic. Obviously, being an academic and wanting access to the kinds of data that can help us understand these mechanisms and how they have an impact is really important as well. So, so for this part of tonight's session, I'm really going to be focusing mostly on a study that we published last year that was looking at misinformation in relation to vaccination on Twitter in the United States. And so it's probably important to just remember that as I'm going through this, a lot of the stuff I'm talking about relates to Twitter specifically, rather than say Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or anything else. And the data I'm really talking about here is often from the United States. So let me start by showing you this. I'm from the Faculty of Medicine and Health. So we typically start every talk with a list of conflicts of interest. And I should say that I have none. I should also note that some of the work that I'm going to present today was funded by the NHMRC, but the most important list here is the people down the bottom of the screen here. So you can see the list of people who worked with me on this particular project, or these projects that are related to vaccination and misinformation. So I thought what I'd do is I'd start off by showing you information about a particular large international survey that was done in conjunction with Facebook by Johns Hopkins Center for Communications Programs. And it actually shows something quite similar to what Alex was showing already. And it was about Australians and other countries and vaccine hesitancy, in the sense that they were asking the question, whether or not, if the COVID-19 vaccine was available, what proportion of people said they would get it. And so other countries, they did lots of these waves, but in Australia, they only had 2 waves. So unfortunately, you don't get to see Australia on this particular screen. But in the most recent one, it was 71.8% of Australians that said that they would probably or definitely get it. And so I guess if we think about this, and we have a look at the graph here, it suggests that we're doing a bit better than France, a bit better than Egypt, a bit better than Nigeria, and we're doing about the same as Malaysia, Indonesia, or the United States are at the moment. The other thing that I guess is also interesting is that Australia has, as Alex mentioned, become more hesitant, in the sense that fewer people would answer this question in a positive and saying definitely or probably yes. And that would be similar to some of the countries you can see here as well, like India, Egypt, Malaysia, Nigeria, who have decreased in the proportion of people who said they probably would or definitely would get the vaccine. So if we look at Australia in a little bit more detail, the same data set, so same survey, this is what they had a look at in Australia. And so there isn't too much difference between younger and older people, more or less educated people, or really between men and women. And the biggest gap from this survey was that women were slightly less likely than men to answer that they would probably or definitely get the vaccine. The other thing to note here is on left, where people have slightly underestimated the proportion of people who they think would go and get the COVID-19 vaccine. And there's not really much of a difference there, but it might sound like people are overestimating vaccine hesitancy in the community a little bit, or it could just be an artifact of how the questions were interpreted by the people who answered the survey. So let's move on to one of the study that we had produced last year. And I'm going to be talking really about the common misperceptions that float around about vaccination. I think we should probably call this misinformation. So to start with, obviously I need to note that this study here is about Twitter. It's about Twitter users in the United States. So Twitter is not everyone, it doesn't represent everyone, and the United States is obviously not necessarily representative anywhere else in the world except for the United States. However, in other studies we've done, we've discovered that Twitter data can be a useful reflection of differences in the information diets of people in different locations. And to the point where at one point we built models of HPV vaccine coverage that used Twitter data, and it turned out that these models were actually better than the models that used information from places like the US Census Bureau in the United States or from the ABS in Australia. So we think Twitter can be a reasonable proxy for representing our information diets. And I guess intuitively, if you think about it, if I follow, Gwyneth Paltrow, or Pete Evans, or Fox News, or other people on Twitter, you can probably guess what my information diet looks like outside of Twitter as well. So the problem with most, actually, I shouldn't say most, actually nearly all social media studies, or studies that use social media data in particular, especially those about vaccination or misinformation in general, is that they tend to focus on only trying to find lots of examples of misinformation, or in the case of vaccine studies, vaccine critical content, and they don't really measure all the other vaccine content that's around. And the second thing is that they assume that the number of times something is posted on Twitter or on Facebook or wherever else is an indicator of how important that is across the entire population. And of course, neither of those things are really good epidemiology. So a few years ago, I actually wanted to directly address these issues in social media research, or data-driven social media research. And so we started collecting every tweet related to vaccines. Previously, we'd been studying HPV vaccines, and we expanded this to include anything on Twitter that relates to vaccines, using a whole bunch of different keywords, including immunization and vax and all that sort of stuff. And so we did that. It's tens and tens of millions of tweets. Then what we did was to sample active users who we were able to locate in the United States. And so we weren't using geotags for this. We used location inference to sample US Twitter users. And then what we did was to check the information diets of those people, the 50,000 plus of them. So we also trained a classifier to split the vaccine critical tweets from all other tweets. And I guess I should stop and point out that when I talk about vaccine critical tweets, there's a pretty strong overlap between vaccine critical tweets and misinformation. So we trained that classifier to split those tweets up, and then we used the follower networks and the retweets of those 50,000 plus users to estimate their information diets, to estimate the exposure they had to information that was related to vaccines, as well as how often they engage with vaccine content on Twitter. So that's not just measuring how many times something is posted, it's actually taking a sample of a population and looking at how often they're exposed to both vaccine critical content as well as any other kind of vaccine content. So that might be vaccine neutral content, or it might even be promoting vaccines. So it's not just what they post, but what they might have seen. And so it turns out that a typical US Twitter user could have seen 757 vaccine-related tweets over a 3-year period. And so those were tweets that were posted by or retweeted by people that they, and just 7 of those tweets would have been vaccine critical. For your typical user, it's the median value. Obviously, so there was also this group, and this group of less than 6%, 5.8% of users who belong to these communities where vaccine critical information was shared more often than other kinds of vaccine content, so neutral and positive. And so this also means that for 94% of US Twitter users, most of the information that they saw related to vaccines was either neutral or it was vaccine promoting. And so that means that misinformation is actually quite rare in terms of what people are exposed to. All right, so now let's look at how often people engage with vaccine content and vaccine critical content. Noting that this was pre-pandemic data, so this is data from before 2020, engagement with vaccine information was really quite rare. So it was just 1.9% of users who were posting or retweeting about vaccines at least once a month on average in the whole period. And around a quarter of users retweeted any kind of vaccine related tweet, so neutral and positive vaccine related tweets at least once in the 3-year period. And 4.5% of the US Twitter users that we sampled retweeted a vaccine critical tweet at least once. So if you think about it overall, what we can see is that not only are most people overwhelmingly being exposed to neutral and vaccine promoting content, but exposure is much, much more frequent than engagement with the topic. Twitter users are rarely engaging in conversations, and less than 1 in 20 people pass vaccine critical information on, and that's over a full 3-year period. And so I guess we need to stop and think about it now, right? If misinformation is common, it exists, people are being exposed to it, but it actually makes up a tiny proportion of what people are exposed to in general. The people who belong to communities where misinformation is really popular make up around 5% of the population. And this is quite a rare group of people who are more often exposed or belong to communities where misinformation is quite common. All right, so let's now think about how the two things go together: vaccine misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. So hopefully from thinking about what we did in that study, it should be obvious that when all we do is count up the number of posts that we've decided are misinformation, and we don't measure what else people are being exposed to, those numbers about misinformation might feel big, but they're essentially meaningless from an epidemiological point of view. And I guess this really relates to this idea of the attention economy that Alex mentioned in her talk as well. So also, when we do measure reach or the virality of misinformation, we need to be thinking about whether more reach necessarily means more risk. If everybody's sharing something about Pete Evans because they're outraged, is this going to convince more people to reject vaccination? Or is it just going to create more polarization without actually changing anyone's behavior? Because the people who followed Pete Evans before and enjoy his content were never going to go get vaccinated. And the people who don't follow Pete Evans and don't listen to him were always going to go and get vaccinated anyway, regardless of whether or not they're being exposed to it. And I guess if you think about it, the only reason I know that Craig Kelly and Pete Evans even exist is because of the level of outrage and the level of outrage sharing that goes on with these people. So it's the only time I ever hear about them is when people are outraged about them. So instead, when I think about how misinformation might relate to behaviors, I more often think about community belonging. That is, I think it's probably more likely that when people feel part of a community, that they're more likely to agree with each other publicly. Repeated exposure to those kinds of opinions within those communities with the people that they trust is what eventually is likely to influence their actions. And so I do worry about how platforms recommend these kinds of groups or communities to people who are just going about their business on social media platforms. And this can happen, and it does happen on Instagram, on YouTube and Facebook. And Alex mentioned this as well, that we don't want to, I guess, have the platforms make us deliberately fall down these rabbit holes and find ourselves in communities where we actually enjoy, being exposed to this content and talking with other people about it as well. So I think we're going to talk a bit more about third and fourth points later, but I just wanted to note that it's possible to correct misinformation in place by responding to it. There have been some good studies that have been done recently to show that when you respond to misinformation by, through debunking methods, if you do that in place, then it can reduce the misperceptions among the audience. You're not going to change the opinion of the person that you're responding to, but you could reduce the misperceptions among the people who are there with them, right? So that's kind of an important one. And I guess the second thing I'd like to point out, and the last point, is that, specialists in public health organizations have learned these lessons experientially. So a PhD student from my group, Marika Steffens, has a couple of really good papers that describe how public health organizations, both community and government organizations who promote vaccination, have learned the lessons that they need to learn to be able to deal with essentially what they would call anti-vaxxers on their Facebook pages, in their Facebook groups, and what they can do to sort of resolve that. All right, so I'll stop there, noting that we're going to be talking about a couple of these things later. But thank you very much.